Good morning in Washington, good afternoon in Europe, and good evening in Tashkent and elsewhere in Central Asia. My name is John Herbst, and I run the Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council. We have a wonderful program for you today regarding the interesting things that are happening in Uzbekistan. In our panel, we have Navbahor Imamova, who's the anchor, editor, and producer with Voice of America's Uzbek Service. We have Dr. Jennifer Brick Murtashvili, the founding director of the Center for Governing and Markets at the University of Pittsburgh, and a non-resident scholar at the Carnegie Endowment for Peace. We have Vinayak Nagaraj, the senior country economist for Uzbekistan at the World Bank. And we have Eldor Tulyakov, the executive director of the Development Strategy Center, focusing on the outcome of Uzbekistan. We will be focusing on reform in Ukraine, domestic developments in Ukraine, and of course, the outcome of Uzbekistan's presidential election. So with that, I think we'd like to turn to our speakers, and I'll be asking them some questions. This will be a moderated conversation. I'll start with Mr. Tulyakov. Eldor, you have been actively involved in the reform process in Uzbekistan. President Mirziyoyev has adopted a well-received open foreign policy. What would you describe as the major achievements of domestic reform in Uzbekistan?
Dear Ambassador Herbst, many thanks for the question. I would also like to thank you for inviting me to this event, and thanks for organizing it. The question you raised is a very broad one, in my opinion, because reforms carried out in Uzbekistan based on the strategy of actions have touched upon almost all spheres. I'm sure most of you have been following them, and I want to name the following significant achievements, which I believe are very important. First is establishing a dialogue with people, which was among the top priorities of the current president. As a result, the state ensured the openness and accountability of public bodies. Additionally, civil society participation in all stages of public participation, in all stages of public administration has also been provided. One of the core principles followed here is public bodies should serve the people, not the people to the public bodies. And another achievement for which Uzbekistan has been criticized for a long time is that finally the state significantly eliminated forced labor and child labor after complex works in cooperation with our foreign and international partners with state. When such negative actions took place, millions of people used to suffer, to be honest, because they were deprived of the right to study and work at their professional workplace and had to put up with the fact that they were damaging their health. The establishment of Public Services Agency has been another successful policy reform that has significantly influenced many other spheres of public administration and the daily life of civilians. A principle such as not the citizens but the documents move was taken as a base of reforms in this direction. A significant achievement was also made in the foreign policy of Uzbekistan, as already mentioned by you, Your Excellency. Thus, openness policy inside the country has been implemented in Uzbekistan's foreign policy also. As a result, we witnessed how the government has carried out active and pragmatic foreign policy based on a good neighborliness policy and willingness to establish friendly and mutual beneficial relations with other countries of the world. For instance, due to these measures, Uzbekistan abolished entry visas for the citizens of more than 90 countries, and citizens of 77 countries can apply for electronic Uzbek visas. And at the end of 2016, the country restored full-fledged relations with international financial institutions and the world community. As a result of the currency reforms, foreign currency exchange was made possible, which has also had broad implications in many ways, be it the simplification of doing business, repatriation, or even the fall of the number of crimes committed due to existing restrictions. The state registration system, Propiska, was significantly reformed, which made the lives of millions easy due to eliminating artificial barriers and inconveniences. Freedom of movement and property rights, exit visas to leave the country. This positive change made the life of millions of people easy and eliminated the waste of time of people. Thousands of people obtained Uzbek citizenship. As a result, they now can practice their political rights and be active in the daily reform processes. This is what I wanted to mention, Your Excellency, within the time given to me. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Mr. Nagaraj, as a senior country economist of Uzbekistan at the World Bank, you obviously have a quite close hold on the economy, you're watching it closely. How would you assess the economic policies of President Mirziyoyev?
Thanks. First of all, it's really great to be with you guys today. It's always really good to chat Uzbekistan. And look, I mean, I think just coming back to your question, the way I often describe it when asked this question, it's probably the most frequently asked question that we get. It's really night and day, right? I mean, when we think about what the economy and what the underlying kind of policy of government was before 2017. And we touched upon this very briefly before they even started, and you referred to this autarkic kind of approach. I mean, Uzbekistan's doors were pretty much closed. There was a tight system in place of extracting natural resources, exporting them, and that was basically it. And with very, very few opportunities for a private sector in a state-dominated, centrally planned system. And when we look at what has happened in these few years since then, a lot has changed. A lot of progress has been made when we think about the market, and the market transition. Something like over 100 or 200 prices used to be controlled in the economy. It's now down to 11 prices, and most of them are regulated utilities that are regulated in most other countries and price controlled. When we look at the room in terms of the business licensing or the business environment for firms to establish their businesses and grow, it's night and day. The other story that I often like to tell is, in late August 2017, you could go and 50% of the country's foreign exchange volumes were being traded in illegal markets and bazaars. And literally 2 weeks later, in mid-September, all of that was happening in the formal banking sector through the exchange rate liberalization. And look, we're 5 years on, right? So we're 5 years on, and we shouldn't, we don't want to just keep looking back. Fruit has been taken. So a lot of the prices have been liberalized in the economy. The doors are open, export controls have been lifted, and we're seeing very, very positive results from that. Record numbers of horticultural exports. Before the coronavirus pandemic, record arrivals of tourists into the country. The visa regime and the liberalization had contributed to that. And so what you have is you have a lot of this kind of, I would call it very green grass that was probably harvested in a first cut. And then you had the pandemic hit. But what's also been really good, even through the pandemic, kind of these 2 years of the pandemic, is that the reforms have continued to happen. The government is beginning to tackle these harder and deeper and more complex issues where reforms have not moved as quickly. So the state continues to dominate 50% of the economy. There is a very large footprint, what the government refers to as its footprint in the economy. And unwinding that position is actually a very complicated affair. They control most resources, when it comes to the factors of production in the economy, when it comes to many of the intermediate inputs like energy. A lot of those things, unwinding the state's control over that to allow the private sector more access to those resources is a process that does take time. Moving from 100% of land ownership to the government into an environment where land is a more tradable good, where land is more secure in its tenure for private sector owners, for private sector leasers as well. That is a process it's starting to take shape in Uzbekistan. So what are the next, when we look back at these 5 years, they have actually put down a very, very good foundation for what is now going to be a deeper and more complex set of reforms to unwind and shape in Uzbekistan. Both the things that have moved quickly, that should move quickly, and the things that have taken time, that should take time, are largely consistent with what we would consider to be good practice when it comes to transitions. So I'll leave it there, and obviously happy to do a bit of a follow-up as we go along.
Thank you. Actually, I'd like to ask you one quick follow-up question to your remarks. I think a relatively new phenomenon for Uzbekistan, which is partly a result of these reforms, is inflation, since the government's not trying to keep a cap on prices. How do you evaluate inflation in Uzbekistan and its meaning, its impact?
So, I think, first of all, just a quick correction. I would say that inflation was actually trending upwards even before the reform started. And I think, if anything, it might have been one of the triggers. It might have even been one of the triggers for an acceleration of why the reform started to move more quickly. I mean, a lot of this comes down to political will and a change of a change of mindset and a willingness to be open under the 2017 and 21 development strategy under President Mirziyoyev. But a lot of the triggers could also have been, related to some of these the underlying structural conditions with prices going up. But yes, I mean, when we look at inflation picked up, and it's not inconsistent, again, with the way you would expect transition economies, particularly in the Soviet Union, post-Soviet Union context. And largely when we look at the inflation and where the inflation comes from, until recently, and let's break this up before and after COVID. Before COVID, a lot of the inflation was just coming from these one-off increases in prices. So electricity tariffs going up, prices of bread being liberalized. I mean, very few countries, even in the post-Soviet context, started their reforms with bread price liberalizations. Those often came at the very end. But the government decided that a large number of prices needed to be liberalized at the start. And so I think those generated some of the inflationary impact. Some of the inflation also came a little bit from, increased lending from the government to entrepreneurs, et cetera. But a large, I would say the dominant component came from these one-off. And when we look back and when we look forward, that's the good kind of inflation, in the sense that one-offs tend to have a one-year impact and then it tapers off, right? So once the prices start to be adjusted, it's not something that goes into a spiral. I think one of the challenges, however, is what's happening with COVID, right? So COVID has exposed Uzbekistan being the double, the cliches are coming out, the double landlocked country that faces high transportation costs because, getting stuff from, even though it's actually fairly close to some of the large markets, there are logistical and bearing some of the brunt of those supply chain constraints more so than, say, countries with access to ports, et cetera. I think another part of it is also the slower pace of some of the agricultural reforms, is contributing. For example, I think more secure land tenure and clearer rights for landowners will have an impact on livestock. For example, livestock production is affected by some of those issues. And I think meat prices, for example, are a very emotive issue in Uzbekistan. But I think, the good part of all of this is the government is well aware of these issues, right? And so they are beginning to tackle where they see these pressures emerging. They also acknowledge, I think, that the underlying structural constraints need to be prioritized. So, I think at this stage, our inflation outlook continues to be fairly positive for Uzbekistan, in the sense that, yes, it's still in double digits and it's not moving to single digits as quickly, as we might have expected it to. That's not for the fault of the authorities. I would probably pin that more on the COVID crisis. But it continues to be an emotive issue, and it's something that everybody needs to constantly monitor, because, that's how discontent forms in a transition process. And it's something that you don't want to see. So I think, continuing to keep a very close watch on that will be very important.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, Navbahur, you've been in Uzbekistan for weeks prior to the presidential elections, which took place last Sunday. Observers have noted the fact that many would-be candidates for the presidency were unable to register. Government officials say that this was because they did not get enough signatures. Human rights organizations offer a different view. What is your assessment of the election process and its meaning for reform in Uzbekistan, the creation of a more open political society?
Thank you, Ambassador Herbst. Hello, everybody. I'm so honored to join this list of experts whose analysis insights I really value and find them to be incredibly relevant, including yours, Ambassador Herbst. Whenever I'm in Uzbekistan, I spend a lot of time with young people. And this time as well, I did that. And I think some of the questions that these young Uzbeks were asking really define today's political environment in Uzbekistan. For example, some law and science students were asking me 2 days before the elections, when I was actually asking them questions, they were sort of throwing these questions at me. Why isn't anybody asking for our vote? That's what they were wondering about. So these young people had never participated, had never voted in any election, but their expectations of the system is that high. And that explains the level of spirit and energy that President Mirziyoyev has been able to produce during his 5 years, and building up expectations, of course. And this election was really about him. It was President Mirziyoyev's referendum. They did not make much impact on the minds of the people. And when I was engaging voters, even though some at least knew about them, they were not interested in their agendas because they didn't see them as relevant in general. Because I think, as these young people were pointing out, nobody was asking for their vote. None of these candidates. President Mirziyoyev, I heard him mention many times that he would be honored to get the citizens' vote. But others never said anything like, okay, President Mirziyoyev doesn't deserve to be reelected, or President Mirziyoyev, I have a better idea than the incumbent. Maybe that's too much to ask from this, environment. Maybe, as many Uzbeks point out, this is the extent of democracy Uzbekistan can have and feel right now. What I found out engaging the public was that nothing is white and black. This is a very diverse political environment where people have all kinds of opinions. People have very strong opinion about the lack of opposition and about the need of opposition. People have very strong opinion about the lack of ideological depth in Uzbekistan. And many say that 5 parties are too much for Uzbekistan, including the leader of the Milli Tiklanış National Revival Democratic Party, who was also running, Alisher Kadyrov. President Mirziyoyev is overwhelmingly popular. I saw that before the elections, on the day of the vote. Even if Uzbekistan had the most democratic election in its history this time, President Mirziyoyev could have gotten elected without any glitch. And people really voted actively. That was something really surprising for me, Ambassador Herbst. I visited many polling stations, and I was really struck by how religious communities of Uzbekistan were voting, coming with their families. There is a voting culture developing in this country, and people don't hide their political views in general. They were quite vocal. Many asked not to be on the record, but they were surely in rural areas. I heard a lot of complaints about how none of those promises, none of the changes President Mirziyoyev has promised and done so far reached those villages, those districts of Uzbekistan. They were still telling me that they were going to vote for President Mirziyoyev because they saw him as the only capable person who can run the country. So, and listening, assessing the report of the OSCE monitoring mission, and also listening to some critical voices here in Tashkent and outside of the capital, we can basically, I don't want to use the word conclude, but we can sort of assess, I guess, to be accurate, that Uzbeks were quite comfortable in general with the way elections went. Yes, there were a lot of problems, a lot of issues, but it did not leave Uzbeks disappointed. They know, many told me and others, that they deserve better presidential campaigns, they deserve better campaigns, better candidates, better political parties, but many also realize that for them to have all those things, the citizenry needs to get more active. So there is that realization in Uzbekistan today, which wasn't there, let's say, 5 years ago when President Mirziyoyev ran for the first time. And I keep on comparing everything to what happened in 2019. If we compare this election to that was more dynamic because that involved debates, that involved more live broadcasts, something that we didn't see this time. Presidential nominees were never seen together. They did not debate with each other. There were a couple of debates with their special representatives, but they were so insignificant in the eyes of the public that they didn't even become news events. And many were asking very openly level of political education and knowledge Uzbeks have. They know that if you're running for presidency, you must be able to debate. And very quickly on those 2 political groups that failed to register, they never had any potential candidates, Ambassador Herbst. They did not have anybody who said, I'm going to run for presidency. There were some aspiring people trying to explain themselves, but these political groups never came anywhere, close to getting registered. And even if they had gotten registered, they applied for registration late. This was mid-spring, and they should have gotten registered by May to be able to actually nominate someone. So the system never took them seriously. And I interviewed these people. I reported on these groups. They didn't get to a point where we could define them as groups with potential candidates, unfortunately.
All right, thank you. Jennifer, you've been watching Uzbekistan for well over 20 years. You've also watched our policy in Afghanistan recently and seen up close how our unrealistic expectations there regarding how society could develop has led to a major policy failure. How would you assess the elections and what they mean about reform in Uzbekistan? What is realistic in your judgment?
I mean, I think there was a real opportunity here in these presidential elections to do something a little different. And I'm actually quite surprised at the way that the government scaled back expectations for these elections over the past, I wouldn't know, 7 or 8 months. They talked quite a lot about, having free and fair elections. As Nabahor pointed out, the 2019 parliamentary elections didn't meet the OSCE standards for free and fair elections, but they certainly featured a dynamism. There were live debates. The members of parliament were certainly talking about issues. They were disagreeing on important issues. One issue actually that came up was the nuclear reactor that Russia is building outside of Tashkent. It's a big issue in the country. So people are actually debating foreign policy issues, debating domestic policies. So I was actually a bit surprised to see sort of the lack of dynamism around this particular election, given what was promised by the government. And, especially considering the open political space that Uzbekistan now has. And as our speakers have all pointed out, so many things have changed. But one of the things that has also changed are expectations, and expectations on behalf of citizens for what they can expect from the government, but also what they shouldn't expect from the government, which is sort of to be left alone in certain spheres, to be able to speak freely and speak openly. And I think that has continued for the most part. Of course, there's still red lines that remain that you cannot cross. But the area of public discourse has certainly grown tremendously over the past 5 years. So I think that given the expansion of public discourse, the growth of civil society, that it was a bit disappointing, I think, not to see the government sort of fulfill its promise to have these free and fair elections this time around. I'm not entirely surprised, but it was certainly, a change of discourse. I don't know whether that was from COVID or, what was the changes behind that, which really led to sort of the ratcheting down of expectations. Because as Nabahor pointed out, the president remains quite popular. I think there have been some disappointments with the reforms, as there always are. It's inevitable in these kinds of contexts where, things do not always go as planned, because you can't plan these kinds of things. And to underscore what Vinny has said, the transition that Uzbekistan is enduring is probably one of the most difficult across the post-Soviet space. Over the past 25 years, Uzbekistan centralized. It had more collective farms under President Karimov than it did under the Soviet leadership. So the country really has quite a lot, faces enormous challenges in terms of its economic transition, in terms of its political transition, much easier to transition political issues than the economic ones. And I'm really glad that we're paying attention to many of the economic reforms, because I don't think that they've received nearly enough attention. And the challenges.
Let me just ask you one quick follow-up question. Do you think then the restrictions that we've seen in the connection with the presidential election was a missed opportunity for the government, that they made a mistake in not being a little bit more open?
Well, a mistake for whom, right? So, certainly for the international community, I think there was a sense of disappointment that these elections were not as open as the government had promised. But I think the bigger concern is the from the perspective of the people. And I think this is where President Mirziyoyev's rhetoric, which is quite enthralling, where he talks about reforms, he promises a lot. He promises a lot of elections. He's talked about elections for local government officials. He's talked about having a lot of elections. These are the promises made by the president, and he doesn't have to say these things, and he doesn't have to raise the expectations of citizens. So I do wonder why this sort of continues to happen. He makes these incredible speeches promising reforms, yet doesn't always deliver on them. And of course, sort of the economic sphere, it's much more difficult, but in the political sphere, it is not. And my concern is that the expectations of citizens continue to be raised in this area, and they understand quite well that what the reality is, and that's what exists on internet forums where you have largely unbridled speech.
Okay, well, I'll just add a comment here before I throw out my next question. I think what you just described is really interesting, fundamental even. But it may also speak to the difficulty of seeking reform. In other words, I think what to suggest is that Mirziyoyev's instincts are in that direction, but then he has to deal with the institutions that existed in the country for decades. Anyway, with that comment, let's go back to our panelists. Okay, Mr. Tulyakov, what do you see as the next steps for domestic reform in Uzbekistan?
Thank you for the question, Your Excellency. Well, when talking about the future of Uzbekistan, one should, of course, refer to the election campaign of His Excellency, the President of Uzbekistan, because he addressed several priorities of his future presidency. People also suggested what they want further, so they had also delivered their proposals on the future of the country. And additionally, a book has also been recently published named The Strategy of New Uzbekistan. Accordingly, because the Uzbek president has also been stating that Uzbek people are building the cornerstone of the third Renaissance, Uzbekistan is further giving a priority in the reforms of educational sphere. So therefore, it's a big challenge to bring Western education and get the scope of people to get higher education. Eliminating poverty would be another priority for the country, which has been started by the initiative of the president, who has started using this term because it has been restricted in usage. And Uzbekistan has committed itself to further reforms in ensuring judicial independence, increasing society's trust in its courts, ensuring human rights and freedom of speech is also a priority task for upcoming years in this direction. And you all know well that Uzbekistan's domestic and foreign policy has given a priority to environmental issues and the RLC problem. These issues remain a challenge for the country and the world community. Also, Uzbekistan has started taking measures to fulfill its energy demand by introducing green energy technologies, for example, to overcome this problem is another priority because we have all been able to test the efficiency of this sphere during the pandemic, especially, and the much needed economic integration will be continued. We are sure, because for that the investment climate is planned to be further improved. Uzbekistan will continue the search for new markets to trade. WTO membership is also on the agenda. Discussions on joining WTO are currently happening in Tashkent. You might have observed. And further support of civil society institutions and NGOs will be a priority. New strategy foresees their role in all directions. Even strengthening the country's defense capability also involves the participation of civil society, to give you an example. Elimination of corruption, which is one of the most significant problems in the society, is also foreseen as an essential challenge to overcome. The state has committed itself to take further measures towards that. Then, of course, due to these worldwide trends, green economy and further digitalization is given a priority. And we even have the Digital Uzbekistan 2030 strategy, which consists of different steps to take in the next few years. Furthermore, administrative reforms will be continued. As such, state apparatus will be optimized because the people people in Uzbekistan have a very special direction for the state, and it will be further actions will be taken to support youth in all their daily lives. Of course, infrastructure reforms, energy reforms are also important for the country, and further steps will be taken towards it. Accordingly, taking this and many other actions foreseen in the strategy of Uzbekistan, it will lead to meeting the UN SDGs, which are given also a high priority in the state agenda, because the new strategy also foresees its commitment to meet the UN SDGs. In general, we can observe that all the positive reforms that started will continue at a more comprehensive level and with faster speed, we hope. So thank you.
All right, thank you. Okay, Ms. Imamova, you're a journalist and perhaps more than most appreciate the changes in the media in Uzbekistan. How significant is this, and what are the current limits on media freedom? And what do you expect in the future in the Uzbek media?
There is a lot of work to be done. I actually realized, well, I started thinking about some of the serious issues because I saw them up close. There is a lot of self-censorship that's going on, especially in the Uzbek language media, where we have seen a lot of progress. One of the best things that has happened during the last 5 years is that the quality of Uzbek content has gotten up. And there are many self-sustaining media outlets out there that really do some remarkable work, including investigative reports. But during the presidential campaign, and I saw that from Washington and here also, especially up close, that even when you have these dynamic live broadcasts that people really enjoy, it's very easy for the stations, for the TV channels to cut out sensitive questions, for example, or to really, not let those aggressive or vocal journalists into the picture. I mean, I saw some of that happening. And also there was a certain level of fear that I saw in Tashkent this time, something that I hadn't seen in the parliamentary elections 2 years ago. Something has changed in that media climate here, where journalists are quite reserved. And I also saw the same level of reservation from the political parties. You would think that because this is a election campaign, that parties would be really going after the media outlets. You have more media than ever. You have more vocal bloggers than ever. Media are everywhere in general, and there were many media events here. Political parties were not really active. They did use the working professionally with the press, and when the OSCE mission was presenting their report. Just to give an example, it was a large auditorium with dozens of journalists with their, very advanced technology, gadgets, and everything else. And we heard a very critical report from the OSCE observers. And you would think that that would be a chance for the Uzbek media to ask a lot of relevant and pointed questions. Very few questions were asked. They all came basically to record the event, but they were not really exploring the issue. So what I'm trying to say is that as somebody who cares deeply about the level of media development, the level of media freedom in the country, and how much work we need to do, I think I'm going back to Washington thinking that we need to really do much more than what we've been doing so far. Every media advocate, every media development organization who's doing work in Uzbekistan, we need to really pay attention to those elements in this campaign. Political reporting, of course, is hard anywhere in any country. But in Uzbekistan, I think this was a really good time for the media community of Uzbekistan to show off their newly acquired skills, their level of professionalization, because a lot has been invested so far, hundreds of trainings. We just completed a year-long training, for example, and we're very proud of our trainees. They're doing some incredible work, but I did not see a very active.
Okay, thank you. Let's see. Mr. Nagaraj, what are the most important things Uzbekistan must do now to develop its economy? What are the current impediments to growth?
So, I think when we think about this, we have a systematic country diagnostic that we are preparing for Uzbekistan that we're just putting out, and it should come out in a couple of months. And I think this is like a comprehensive look at exactly this question. I think when we look at all the progress that's been made, there are still several constraints that limit Uzbekistan from kind of fully taking off. Land and capital are still largely under state ownership and control. That ownership and the allocation of land and capital in the economy is still very much guided through a central planning system. Even if it's not the same as it used to be, it's kind of still held hostage by more than 2,000 state-owned enterprises that need this preferential access and low-cost access to inputs to continue producing in the economy. They employ 1/5 of the workforce. They're still a very important part of the economy. land tenure is constraining what I think is a very, very productive, very bright opportunity in agriculture and horticulture for Uzbekistan. One important change that we didn't get a chance to talk about in the previous question that I want to come back to is the removal of propiska restrictions, right? So onerous restrictions that kept people in rural areas and did not allow migration to happen to cities have been lifted. But you still need it can't just be that people can move to cities. You need the right approach to urban planning. The public services need to catch up. So all of that is going to take time. And I think the other part of it is a very important aspect of the economic reform program has been inclusion. Making sure that reforms like propiska have had very high, but still those opportunities are I wouldn't say are universally available. Women, youth, disabled citizens, they continue to face very significant challenges, right? Tertiary education rates are still very low. So human capital investments, which had to play second, they were kind of second fiddle to all of these economic, industrial planning and industrial diversification investments through the last 30 years. They declined, right? So human capital really, the quality of human capital infrastructure declined. And reversing those is not something that you can just do overnight. It takes a bit of time. Amidst all of this, what Uzbekistan now has are these very ambitious goals. They want to halve poverty by 2026. They want to become an upper middle income country by 2030. And this is a very ambitious, they're setting up a very, very ambitious way forward. And it's going to require a lot. I mean, just to become an upper middle income country by 2030, the country is going to have to grow by something close to 10% in real terms on average between now and 2030. Now, this might seem like a very high amount, but also remember that the base of the economy is still very low. They're starting to catch up from a low base. So it is possible, but it really, really requires many of these constraints that I described to be lifted much faster than, say, the progress that's been made over the last 5 years. So what I would say is I would characterize the last 5 years as a very large preparatory phase for some really, and I think the probability of success or the rate at which the country will hit those goals successfully is going to depend very much on the acceleration of these reforms, and to do it in a way that continues what I think has been a hallmark of the way the reforms have happened. Every major structural reform that has taken place over the last 5 years has been accompanied by equivalent social reforms that I think have liberalized the environment for people to think, to expand their thinking when it comes to entrepreneurship, for new ideas to happen in the economy. And I think, and for more people to be included, measures like, on equal opportunities for women or equal opportunities for disabled citizens. These laws have been passed and now the implementation needs to happen. And it needs to continue. This approach to deeper structural reforms need to be matched by that. So just to summarize, we at least from my perspective or from the bank's perspective, there are 4 really important areas that the government really, really needs to kind of with laser precision to hit these goals it has to focus on. First, I think is the fact that the private sector is still very small. It's too small and it needs to grow. It has to be the engine of job growth. Something like 600,000 job seekers are still competing for about 200,000 jobs in the economy. This needs to change and the gap needs to be removed, right? So then when it comes to licensing restrictions or, monopoly and competition policy, in many sectors like telecoms and aviation, there's still a very heavy presence. Chemicals, these are sectors that actually have a high potential to generate the kind of 10% growth that the country needs, but they're still dominated by monopolies. They're still dominated by very onerous state-controlled restrictions. And I think removing those faster and making the environment more liberal faster, I think would make a very big difference. A lot of regulatory reform is still needed to improve the quality of regulation, to reduce fragmentation. Things like individual investor resolutions where one company and another company that are competing in the same sector can negotiate completely different terms and conditions for their businesses. That has to end. And many of these are done as secret resolutions, right? And so there needs to be some transparency to the playing field for competition. Simultaneously, the work that the government has done on infrastructure needs to continue, right? So the energy sector, all of these reforms need to now deliver the results in terms of reliable access to infrastructure. The second aspect of this is what is the role of the state, right? So you've got the private sector that needs to take over the engine of growth. And then the question comes, well, okay, what is the future role of the state? Well, that should be fairly straightforward. Less economic production and more enabling, right? So it needs to become more of a market enabler. It needs to get out of the SOE production system of public investment has been very high in recent years. A lot of money has been pumped into public investments, but the way in which those investments are managed is still very fragmented, very reliant on SOEs. The legal and regulatory environment needs to have, a much, much more enabling environment for, and the state needs to play more of that role in improving that. When it comes to public service delivery, Uzbekistan actually has done a pretty good job of delivering basic public services across the country to a certain standard. But still there is this kind of sometimes a confusing approach to delivering specialized public services in places where people might not actually in the long term be there. So they need to kind of come up with the right approach to urbanization and a right approach to what kind of public services need to be delivered to what standards in what parts of the country. And a lot of that depends on decentralization. I think sometimes this very heavily centralized approach to service delivery serves Uzbekistan well, but I think it also can detract from allowing local priorities to emerge from local decision making. And this is where I think Jennifer mentioned some of this. I am hopeful that some of these ideas that have been floated by the president and by other people about what the future role of these regional governments needs to be, both in terms of the kengashes and the local democratic processes that are evolving, but also in terms should take center stage in the next 5 years. Public accountability, is another area where I think a lot of work needs to happen. Vested interests and corruption, they are going to be there. We can dance and skirt around these issues, but we know from every post-Soviet transition experience, these risks are ever present, right? And the best way to defeat those vested interests and corruption risks, whether they are from oligarchic interests or whether they're just from status quo bias of people that just enjoy the way things are and don't want to change, is much better citizen and community engagement and actually changing the relationship. At the moment, citizens can engage with the government by complaining, and I think those complaints are being well addressed. There's a very reactive and responsive government when it comes to these receptions and the virtual receptions. But changing the relationship from being a one-way traffic system to actually co-opting the citizens to pass in terms of feedbacks on the quality of public services and incorporating that into the way the government is governing, I think will make a huge difference, right? Because I think it starts to increase public accountability that directly results in these service delivery improvements that I think has a very important bearing to the quality of the transition process. Okay. The third and kind of important area that I think is really important here. So when we're talking about the private sector and the role of the state, it's what then happens to people, right? So and the improvements that need to happen in terms of the rural and urban quality of public services. But also, I think one of the hallmarks, again, of the reform process, poverty is no longer a dirty word. Poverty is no longer a taboo word in Uzbekistan. And I think that's something we should be celebrating. And I think now taking that concept where poverty is actually a thing, it's acknowledged, it's part of the name of a ministry that used to be the planning powerhouse of the country. It's now the Ministry of Economic Development and Poverty Reduction. So I think continuing this focus on making sure that the government is putting in the right policies to strengthen the safety nets, to reduce unemployment, this will be very, very important, alongside what I would consider to be important, deeper regulatory reforms to reduce exclusion. They've passed the legislation. Now they need to implement that with a lot more depth. The last and most important issue, I think, for me in the long-term perspective, but also stuff that generates, I think it's reforms that will generate immediate short-term results as well, is better resource and environmental management. I think, the government is beginning to think much more clearly in realizing that it has an unprecedented opportunity. 50% of this economy is still in the state, and a large part of this economy is still at a very, very nascent early stage of the transition. And that means that most of these assets that need to be modernized have not yet been modernized in the economy. The production, this is the best time to invest in environmentally sustainable approaches, right? So by investing today, I think it's going to be cheaper to do that. It's also going to put Uzbekistan, I think, in a much more competitive position to deal with what is a changing global market for preferences. The world is changing and preferences are changing. So Uzbekistan's exports and if it wants to continue to be a fine purveyor of goods and services to the world, I think those fine goods and services need to be better produced in better standards, because you're going to have a more discerning global consumer. So I think actually thinking and putting environmental sustainability first is going to be very important. But it also has immediate bearings. Energy efficiency is a huge issue. Uzbekistan is one of the least energy efficient countries in the world. and actually taking the energy efficiency agenda very seriously could create, I mean, as it has in countries like where I come from New Zealand, where energy efficiency is just, it created an entire new market of jobs and skills and technologies. And I think that too has an important role to play here. So more private sector, changing and reshaping the role of the state, investing in people, putting the environment first. I think, a combination of these reforms, and I would say it's very nice to put everything, that sounds like the kitchen sink. So to give some prioritization, I would put the private sector reforms really at the heart of the agenda for the next 5 years, because I think that's really what's going to generate these high rates of growth and poverty reduction that the government wants. But that's kind of the framework that I would use to think about the next 5 years. Sorry, I've packed a lot in there, and I know that Doug is now giving me a time warning.
Jennifer, last question before we turn to the audience. And by the way, for those tuning in, if you tune into the Q&A section, you'll see we already have a fairly lively exchange with some answers. We'll be pulling from those questions that are there now for our panelists after Jennifer answers my final question. Okay, Jennifer, besides criticism of the election, human rights groups have also criticized the Uzbek government, for example, for treatment of Muslims who do not attend quote-unquote government mosque. What is your summary assessment of domestic reform, and what should come next?
So I think that this issue of accountability and participation is got to be key to all of the kinds of things that Vinny has just outlined. So the government, I mean, we hear again, reduce poverty by 50%? These incredible growth rates that the government wants to achieve. These are public declarations. In order to achieve this, you have to be held accountable, right? I mean, you cannot do this kind of ambitious reform from the top down, not at the scale that they're talking about. And even if they think that they want to replicate the China model, in China, there was a lot of participation at the local level in terms of citizen participation in processes. But what we're seeing in Uzbekistan is actually sort of a more centralization of authority from the provinces to the center. In some ways, some of the re-centralization has made sense in like the education sphere, but there has to be more meaningful participation at the local level to hold officials accountable, because for a good reason, because the president talks a lot about holding these officials accountable and that the citizens have a voice. The president's talked about participation. So these are issues that have been raised by the president. And I'm just really worried if the president doesn't deliver on this, allowing more voices into this process, that it's really could undermine a lot of the goals that I think we would all agree are important for Uzbekistan in terms of poverty reduction, in terms of service delivery, in terms of all the kinds of economic and structural changes that are required. You have to have a participation emerging right now.
Okay, thank you. We'll now go to questions. We'll start with a question from John Bedard. He says, hi, thanks for such an interesting talk so far. Here's the question. How does Uzbekistan's foreign policy priorities in Afghanistan tie into the political will at home to either help or ignore the continuing U.S. mission in Afghanistan? Are Uzbeks ready to wash their hands of Afghanistan, or is there a desire to stabilize Central Asia after the Taliban takeover? I think we'll give that to Eldor first, and then maybe Jennifer wants to jump in as well. But first, Eldor.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the question. Afghanistan issue has been the priority of the new Uzbekistan, and President has identified Afghanistan as part of the Central Asia, and President also initiated several initiatives, including at the regional level, at the international level, at the UN, for example, stating that we should have a separate committee to deal with Afghanistan issues. Which means Uzbekistan has been paying close attention to the stabilization of the situation in Afghanistan by peaceful means, because we want peace throughout the Central Asia, and Afghanistan is a country which which is a concern of not only Central Asian countries but the worldwide. That's why even now Uzbekistan has been actively trying to attract the attention of foreign partners of Uzbekistan to deal with Afghanistan issue, because if we, for example, if we leave Afghanistan, including our partners, it means those people who have been somehow supported by international donors might start, I would say, to be honest, start starving due to the crisis currently happening, due to the fact that fields are not generating as much food as required. That's why these dry conditions over there does not allow to grow food over there. That's why Uzbekistan has been trying to get the traction of the Western countries by saying that we cannot leave this country alone. Otherwise, if we leave them alone, these people who has to feed their families, they might take wrong actions, including, let's say, drug trafficking or selling of weapons left by Western countries. And all of this will lead to other unwanted conditions, not only in the region, but it might be also foreseen in other countries also. That's why Uzbekistan is on the side of stabilization of the situation in Afghanistan with the help of all relevant actors. And that's why we believe Western countries should always pay attention and should not leave Afghanistan alone. And plus, we believe that Shanghai Cooperation Organization is another Afghanistan. That's why it should also be further discussed in the framework of Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Many thanks.
Okay, thank you. Jennifer, do you want to jump in on this as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the U.S. presence in Afghanistan was inherently destabilizing, especially over the past 10 years. And so while I think many in the U.S. are, concerned that Uzbekistan is going to wash its hands of Afghanistan, I think just the opposite is happening. You're seeing a much greater engagement. There are more opportunities for Uzbekistan to negotiate and engage directly and actually shape policies in Afghanistan than there were when the U.S. was there. So, the situation in northern Afghanistan was very fraught for the past 7 or 8 years, highly unstable. And I think the Uzbeks see this as an opportunity to try to restabilize and provide some kind of stability to the country. Of course, it's a regime that they don't necessarily want, but the alternative hasn't necessarily been very promising for Uzbekistan and other Central Asian states. And finally, Uzbekistan has embarked on this very, I would say, bold economic integration process, right? Trying to integrate Central Asia and South Asia together to develop trade and exchange. And, Uzbekistan as a doubly landlocked country really relies on its neighbors. And Afghanistan is really an important geographical position. If Afghanistan is peaceful, then, costs and all of these things to trade really decrease. So Uzbekistan has put quite boldly, I think, with the Taliban. But it's not just Uzbekistan. There's a news report, the Turkmenistan delegation is visiting Kabul right now and trying to put pressure on the Taliban for this Tapi pipeline that they want so badly. So these regional countries really see now an opportunity in Afghanistan. And while the United States can wash its hands of what's happening there's a very serious famine taking place in Afghanistan right now that has serious regional implications, especially for Uzbekistan. So let's hope that trade continues and opportunities for exchange continues and that humanitarian aid that seems to be trapped at Termez can somehow get inside of Afghanistan.
Okay, Jennifer, thank you. We have a question from, and forgive me if I mispronounce your name, Terrell Kwashnik. It's a technical question. He says a large percentage of very young people with a 50-50 split of urban and rural in Uzbekistan. Does anyone know the percentage of voter turnout during the election?
I can answer.
Please,
so overall, the turnout was more than 80%. The Central Election Commission, so it's a huge number. And when I asked some of the observers if they thought that this number was accurate, they said yes, because they confirmed and they believe in what the Central Election Commission was providing. We haven't gotten into the details yet, and I'm sure if we inquire, the Central Election Commission would give us more numbers. But overall, the majority of the Uzbek population population are under the age of 45, and then the Central Election Commission says that the majority of the voters of all these more than 16 million people voting in Uzbekistan on Sunday, of more than 20 million people who have the right to vote in the country. That's been unprecedented. So we can safely say that this was the largest number of votes that Uzbekistan has ever seen. But there is something else that we should mention. You know, none of the political parties studied voters. The government did not do any studies, as far as I know, about voters and voting in the country. So there isn't really any reliable data outside of what the government gives you to analyze this. And then media outlets haven't really done any surveys either. There is very little audience research or market research done in general. So Uzbekistan needs a lot of work there. Ambassador Herbst, if you could allow me, I just wanted to make a couple of remarks about Afghanistan and reforms.
Okay,
on Afghanistan. You know, Uzbekistan is now allowing all UN agencies, to whoever is involved in humanitarian assistance, to use its infrastructure, specifically Termez infrastructure, to deliver aid to Uzbekistan. So last week there were 3 airlifts that was done by the UNHCR, UN Refugee Agency, to deliver. So basically the goods come to Termez, and from there they are trucked to Mazar Sharif, because the Afghan airports. And so Uzbeks are very confident about their engagement with the Taliban. They define it as an engagement with the Afghan people. They refer to the new leadership in Kabul as the interim government. So you don't really hear much the Taliban from Uzbeks. They believe that the region is in sync, despite the fact that we have a more critical government, you know, of the Taliban in Dushanbe. Deputy Foreign Minister Furqat Siddiqov told me that all countries were working very closely on Afghanistan, and Foreign Minister Kamilov was in Tehran with Ismail Ergashev, special representative on Afghanistan, and there they were also quite vocal. So Tashkent doesn't want Afghanistan to be isolated. Tashkent wants international financial institutions to help Afghanistan. Uzbekistan is continuing to deliver electricity to Afghanistan, even though it's not getting paid. They know that Afghans can't afford to pay, but they're hoping that eventually they'll get paid. I've also been talking to a lot of Afghans here in Uzbekistan. I was really surprised to find out how much traffic is there between these two countries. The border is partially open, but Afghans, specifically Uzbek Afghans, are coming for business purposes, for other purposes, actually, even as tourists. So that I didn't know, honestly, before coming to Tashkent. And so I'm going to go to Termez very soon, and I'm going to find out what's the real picture there. But there is very active diplomacy going on here. And we've also been hearing some interesting things from Kazakh and Kyrgyz diplomats. On the reforms, you know, this election campaign, Jennifer, and you and I, we've talked a lot about this. This was such a reality check for President Mirziyoyev. He was the one, he basically, obviously being for the country, he held some really candid conversation with voters where voters really complained. They talked about issues. So that was really impressive. Unfortunately, the media didn't really bring out all those discussions and conversations, but what he heard from voters were, and I've talked to some people who actually met him, that his reform agenda hasn't really worked well for many people in the country, and that they're still, you know, waiting for all these promises that he has made to be realized, specifically on the economic side of the issue and social economic changes. And some people have been quite honest with President Mirziyoyev about the lack of political freedom as well, that, you know, they want more diversity, political diversity. They want to hear new ideas. And some of them even complained about existing parties.
Now, Bahor, may I interrupt you? Because we're going to come to another question where I think you'll be able to discuss this. Okay, so I'm going to move on to another question. Sure. We'll come back to you in question after this. Okay, we have a question from Shari Wilson. She says, I also served as a seconded election observer in Fergana, and found young people have higher expectations for the government and their future than people in other age groups. But several told me that if the economy does not improve and more educational opportunities become available, they plan to leave Uzbekistan. what is being done to address the aspirations of young people? And I'd like Eldor to answer this. And Nabhor, I'll be back to you with the question after that, okay?
Sure.
Thank you. This is a very important question because, as I told you, more than half of the population of Uzbekistan consists of young generation. That's why President has been constantly meeting with the young generation, and he has been talking about young generation not only within separate meetings with young, but also, you know, that he often holds meetings with the members of the cabinet, and most of the time during his speech, he always talks about the young. Plus, you know that the president has been active in initiating proposals at the regional and international level with regard to youth. That's why the same thing has been implemented in the country. First, we have the separate credit lines for young people who want to be involved in business and who want to create job markets. That's why this is very much well practiced. Then we have separate industrial zones where only young people can open up their businesses. This is another issue. Then, of course, we cannot cover all of them with higher education, although it was doubled within these last 5 years. We still have those who do not have a profession to earn money. That's why Uzbekistan has been opening up these vocational training courses throughout the whole Uzbekistan, where we train the young generation, especially those after school, so that they can earn some money. They are taught the different professions in those educational institutions, so that they can earn money there. Then, of course, several grants are also initiated by the youth agency and NGO fund, which support young people so that they carry out their socially important projects. I would say this is, and then plus, of course, we have been learning the opinion of people since 4 years. I think Vinny can confirm that we have been doing it with World Bank throughout the listening to the citizens of Uzbekistan projects, and the project results show how satisfied people are with the ongoing reforms. And it's good to note that these surveys are done by separate organization. Higher of it is positive. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We have two questions which are rather similar. And Nabhor, I want to turn to you first because this is what you were addressing before. First one is from Alex Folks. It's the following. Is it not the case that one of the most significant problems facing Uzbekistan is the failure to allow opposition parties or independent candidates? The 5 parties are essentially arms of the state with candidates, as in 2019, who didn't seem to know what they stood for, and in some cases, which party they were meant to be standing for. Genuine progress in the economic sphere appears to be hamstrung by the lack of democratic development. And then we have, after that, Matthew Schaff. Questions for any and all panelists. Economic reforms have been highly touted, though there appears to be little change in the political sphere. The recent election and continued politically motivated imprisonment are perfect examples. Is there a point where absence of meaningful political reform will be a significant impediment to growth? So now, Bahor, please keep this to 2 or 3 minutes, and then Jennifer, you'll have a shot at this as well. Please.
There's a clear absence of political discussions and political discourse in the country. Actually, I would argue that 2019 was when Uzbeks started to get to know about their political parties. And we have to be honest to say that these 5 political parties are the products of the Karimov period. You know, the government is the father of all these parties. And the members of these parties argue that they have been through a certain, evolution, and they have changed, they have expanded. But they're tiny political groups. If you combine all the members of all these 5 parties, they don't even make it 1 million. So they're very small, and they don't really promote themselves in a way that, other political parties do around the world. They don't work closely with media. They have sort of bloggers who work for them. And, as you know, bloggers have come to play a significant role in the public discourse in this country. But still, especially during this year, when we watched very closely what happens in terms of the candidates emerging and what happens to these two political groups that were seeking registration and trying to kind of make themselves relevant, that professionally moderated discourse wasn't there. And the question is, where do you really start that? I was really struck by the questions and then the insights of many voters who really were questioning the relevance of parties, because they don't see parties doing anything relevant for their lives. There is no party politics in Uzbekistan. The only time they hear parties doing something is when media discuss kinds of bills or maybe debates that are happening or being discussed, or debates that are happening in the Uzbek legislative chamber. And so people really want to see why they need these political parties. And if we keep in mind the level of the lack of democratic experience this country has, and then and the way how, if we keep in mind the Soviet past and everything else, it becomes very clear why people really don't value them. Many people were all fatalistic, some kind of a losing conclusion, but for them it's like, okay, we've never had any opposition parties in Uzbekistan. We don't know what to do with them. And if anybody emerges vocally claiming to want to be in the opposition, we're very good at slapping them down. And then these two political groups really struggled to gain some legitimacy, and they're still around and they're still talking, discussing their points, but they haven't really been this popular movement. So what to do in these kind of things, right? Many people, many voters were basically saying also, why do we need political, they were asking me basically about why we raised the lack of opposition as a problem. A middle-aged female voter really challenged me at one of the polling stations. She was almost like screaming at me, saying that, why do we need opposition parties? How relevant can they be? There are opposition parties all around the world. I don't see them solving problems. Why do you think having an opposition party would solve Uzbekistan's problems? And many people were joining her in that argument. I think people really need to hear each other in this society. And I think that's where, we need political discourse. And obviously, economic development and political developments are tied to each other. And I see media being the key factor here. A lot of work needs to be done. There is a lot of room for professional, real NGOs to do. A lot of political development work that needs to be done. A lawmaker yesterday asked me how Uzbekistan can do better there.
We have only 3 minutes left.
And I didn't have any answers for him.
Thank you. Jennifer.
The reason that people don't understand what political parties do is because political parties haven't had the chance to operate in any really meaningful way. And societies that are democratizing, political parties can play a very constructive role in reforms. They educate voters, they differentiate political. There should be two main political parties. It's a first past the post voting system. So the party structures are all controlled by the central government. And when they are orchestrated in such a way, that doesn't really give a lot of space for meaningful, debate in the political sphere. Now, that's not to say that there isn't meaningful political debate in society. It's just not happening in the formal political system. And I think there's a real opportunity, because these organizations, political parties, could be the engines of reform. But we also have to understand, what does democracy look like from the perspective of Uzbekistan? You look around the neighborhood, you look at the failed experiments in Kyrgyzstan, you look at the failed experiment in Afghanistan. You look around your neighborhood and I think that's why we're not seeing the kind of groundswell that Navbahor has described. We have to recognize its absence, but also understand why we're not seeing such huge demand for it at the current time. But, this is also a function of the controls that, people understand where the red lines are.
Okay, thank you. We've got literally 1 minute left. There's a question from Patrick Dalzell, which I think is a very important one. To what extent is there opposition to the reform program, both internal and external? And everyone will have 30 seconds to describe what they think that is. Eldor, Would you say there's any opposition, internal or external, to reform? Vested interests, for example.
The real opposition may be the people who have been actively, maybe if they're not satisfied with what the ministers, and that's good that mass media has been reporting on all of these criticisms addressed from the society. So this.
Okay, that's good. Thank you, Vinny. 30 seconds.
And I think I would say that the only opposition that I think I can think of are I wouldn't even put all vested interests in this. I would say the status quo beneficiaries.
Okay, thank you.
Yep, and that's it. And I think when
good.
you look at the population, there's something like 80 or 85%. We continue to survey this every month. Believe that the country is headed in the right direction, and I think that's because.
Thank you. We have no time now. Bahor, 30 seconds.
Deeply internal, vested interests, very, very close to the highest levels of the government. That's where you have the opposition.
Okay, good. Thank you. Jennifer, 30 seconds.
In addition to those vested interests, we can't forget about the people who have been protesting land reform, right? I mean, confiscation of land, confiscation of property. We haven't seen it a lot over the past couple of months, but there's quite a movement that really triggered civil society. So there was definite.
Thank you very much. I appreciate your discipline in answering that last question, all of you. And I thank you all for joining us. I think it was an interesting discussion. I think we'll be doing more on Uzbekistan and Central Asia in next year.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.